So now we turn to language. We are going to start off by going over some of the basics, just basics in terminology that you might learn in a speech pathology class, for example. Then we're going to talk about early communication, kind of getting the lifespan approach, talk about the brain, and then we're going to hit a little bit harder on how we can help people, the children, learn how to speak better. So some of the basics here. The first basic, phonemes, or phonology of the study. So phonemes are the smallest parts of speech that can be combined to produce words and sentences. The smallest parts of speech that can be combined to produce words and sentences. So an example here is the A in mat versus the A in mate. The A versus A. Those are two distinct sounds. English has 40 phonemes, and those 40 combine to create every word in the English language. So every word that I speak to you this entire lecture is going to be made up of one of those 40 phonemes. Other languages have as many as 85, some as few as 15. So if a language requires you in some circumstances to roll your R's, that's something that in English we don't have. If there is some kind of clicking, that's something English doesn't have. So those would be different types of phonemes that we don't have. Morphemes, on the other hand, are the smallest language unit that has meaning. So some of these things are used to complete words, the small parts. Others add information that is necessary to interpret it. So if you put an S onto the end of most words in English, you get plural. If you put ed on the end, you get past tense. So if you're making a word plural, so let's say falcon versus falcons, there's only the S that's different between the two, but it gives you a difference in meaning. Syntax. Syntax helps explain why you might not understand this sentence, was at turtles looking man the two, but you might understand the man was looking at two turtles. They're the exact same words, but just jumbled around in a way that you can't comprehend. So we can kind of think of this as grammar, and without it, we don't understand each other even if everything else is there, even if all of the words are words that you or I might understand in other contexts, or if it was in the proper form, we just wouldn't get it without that. Now, function and content words. Function words are things like prepositions, conjunctions, quantifiers, so and, or, but, for, yet, nor, so, many, from, things like that. Whereas content words are nouns, verbs, most adjectives and adverbs, so man, turtles, looking, humongous, greenish. Content words express meaning as opposed to function words. And why do we make this differentiation? Well, it turns out that the words can be treated differently in different situations. Some disorders make it such that you can better understand some of the words versus others. And also, the order of learning of function versus content words is different. Generally, children start to learn nouns first, nouns, content words, versus function words come later. Semantics get to meanings of words that are not always apparent. So if you say Ellie was hit by a ball, that could be different than a ball hit Ellie. It could be the same words in a similar context, but depending on how you say it, the order of the words could be different. Or Frank discovered a louse combing his beard. What's happening there? Did he discover a louse when he was combing his beard? Did he discover a louse who was combing his beard? It depends on how you are emphasizing things. And finally, prosody stresses rhythms, changes, and pitch. So if you say, "Am I that odd?" versus "Am I that odd?" there's a little bit of a difference there. Or, since Jay always jogs 5 miles, seems like a short distance to him. You might not have got where I was going. It might have confused you halfway through because I said since Jay always jogs 5 miles, and that actually makes sense, but if it doesn't really in the larger context of it. So each of these things are learned in different ways. Different disorders can function in different ways as well. So let's go on to the origins of language. How do we get language? Well, there are some people who say that it is a learned skill, and this is somewhat of a learning theory approach, that language acquisition follows the basic laws of conditioning. If you are reinforced, you'll do more of it. If you are punished when you make an error, you will do less of that thing. And this, of course, fits with our behaviorist, almost early social learning, but also we'll get to social learning theory in a minute here. So if a child makes a noise and dad says it back, that is reinforcing. Child makes a noise, dad says it back to them, that is inherently a good thing for the child. It's a good feeling. Now, you also can say that they learn to speak when they're rewarding for making sounds close to speech. So if my youngest, 7 weeks old, just started making real not words, of course not, but the sounds that could, approximate some kind of semblance of a word. So or ooh, things like that. Phonemes. So we were ecstatic at this. But with my older daughter, if she did that now, we probably wouldn't say anything. It'd just be like a thing that she does. So as children make sounds closer and closer to speech, you get happier and happier as it gets closer, and you will become, over time, less enamored by them, making their basic coos and things like that. So you shape them over time. Now, some people say that it is an innate skill. Noam Chomsky is famously in this camp. And they would say it is genetically determined, and there is an innate mechanism that drives language development. So people are born with the innate capacity to use language, and it will emerge more or less automatically due to maturation. Now, yes, some people will not have that skill if they are forced into extreme isolation, but that is far outside the norm. So more or less automatically. And there's also a notion that there's some kind of universal grammar that all languages have. All world languages have an underlying structure. And because of this, people in this kind of nativist camp say that there is a language acquisition device, an LAD. And this permits understanding of language generally, and it provides a set of strategies for learning language. Now, this is supported by genes that are actually related to speech production, and also infants' brains process language with similar structures that adults do. So our brain really does seem to be pre-wired to be able to learn language. Now, there are some specific support for language acquisition device. There are language universals, nouns, verbs, and objects. Plurals and possessions. Those things are in all languages. But it's also supported by the fact that we hear languages differently than we hear non-language speech. Meaning that if you were to be in an MRI, and they've done these studies before, in an MRI, and you listen to someone speaking, a different part of your brain will light up than if you listen to similarly pitched non-language sounds, which is shocking. I mean, it's amazing. Your brain seems to automatically classify things as speech versus non-speech, and it's something that it takes a split second and you and I have no control over. Pretty crazy. And then the final thing is the critical period for language development you guys are probably aware of. If you don't learn a language in the first 10, 12 years or so, it's really, really hard, borderline impossible to do so. And that's also why learning a foreign language is so good early on, because we are just naturally better at learning when we are younger, specifically languages. Now, there is an interactionist approach where it combines the two of them that says that language is produced through a combination of genetically determined predispositions and the environment. And this interactionist approach would accept that there are innate factors that shape the outline of speech development. They might argue how this language development goes on because of reinforcement and punishment. Okay, so we mentioned briefly there parts of the brain. Let's get into them. There are two distinct parts of the brain. So Broca's area, as you can see in the slide, damage to Broca's area inhibits the ability to speak. They have aphasia. It's very, very difficult to speak. It's slow, and it doesn't sound like speech. It's the kind of speech where you might even want to help giving them a word to just help them along. So let me pull up this. This is an example.
Okay. So what's your name?
Scott. Oh, no. Sarah Scott.
That's right. And how old are you?
I can't.
Try.
I can't.
Oh. You're 19. 19. Yeah. And what happened to you?
Stroke.
And notice here she's going to be able to produce content words much better than function words.
You had a stroke last year.
Yes.
And what happened? Can you remember what happened?
School.
Noun.
And English class.
Noun.
Okay.
And I book.
Noun.
And I read it aloud. But I can't because stroke. And so I turn and also it's the same as the same kind of thing as you know,
Pins and needles.
yeah,
like pins
the
and
same, and also farmers, but.
So that is a clip from YouTube, obviously. She pretty bravely has put a bunch of those videos up, and it's actually pretty amazing to see how much better she's been doing lately. It seems through speech therapy, she's become actually very good. You'd be surprised, so check it out. So Broca's is what is what is responsible for producing language. And you have a stroke there, you can't do it as well. Wernicke's, on the other hand, is the more rear part, and that has to do with language comprehension. So you can notice in that video that the girl Sarah, she could seemingly understand everything that the other woman was saying, but she couldn't say it. So her stroke was likely in Broca's versus Wernicke's. If you had a stroke in Wernicke's, then you just couldn't understand what people were saying at all. So let's move to the more developmental parts of this. So the first noise that any child makes is a cry. That's fairly straightforward. But pre-linguistic communication is any kind of sound, expression, gesture, imitation, anything that is an attempt at communication. So sign language would be an example of this, or could include an example of this. Crying is included there as well. And this is going basically from birth. Many kids will come out of the womb screeching. Babbling, that is speech-like but meaningless sounds. So any kind of actually, that's probably even too complicated, excuse me. But nonetheless, it starts 2 or 3 months or so and continues up through about a year. And in this time, they'll repeat the same vowel constantly, but they might change their pitch. Usually it starts with vowels. And then at 5 months or so, they add consonants. Now, even deaf children do this, very interestingly, and they babble with their hands. And one of the just craziest things that we've learned since we got neuroimaging is that brain regions are the same for hand gestures and for speech production. That's really, really cool. So people who are using sign language are using the same, well, similar parts of their brain, at least. Now, by 6 months, the babbling actually starts to reflect the sounds that they're exposed to the point that untrained listeners, so you or I, could actually distinguish the language that children are babbling in. French, Arabic, and your book also mentions Cantonese, but it's pretty much across the board. So when do first words happen? Well, generally speaking, we would say somewhere between 10 to 14 months is kind of the average, can be as early as 9. But the big problem is that definitions of first word differ. So what does it mean for a child to speak their first word? Is it when an infant clearly understands and can produce a sound that is close to a word used by adults? So mama, if they're trying to request something. It could be when children give a clear, consistent name to a person, object, event, for example. So mama would only count if it's consistently applied to the same person. Kids will probably at some point in time babble mama, dada, but not because they're labeling their mother or dada as mama and dada, but just because they're babbling it. So it doesn't really matter. That's for you to decide. There's no truth of it. But most first sounds for children are similar. Ah is one of the first ones. First consonants, P's, B's, M's, and this is probably why Papa and Mama are used as Mama and Dada or Mom and Dad, because they happen so early and it's so exciting for us to hear that they are saying that. Now, by about 15 months, kids will have a vocabulary of on average 10 words. And that vocabulary keeps expanding until the one word stage is done at around 18 months, when they would then move on to 2 words. Now, 2 words is also about the time that they start to say things they might never have heard. 2-word sayings are also very similar cross-culturally. They are almost always just content words. And this is actually true for sign language and children who are deaf. They don't add function words for a while. So they don't have the vocabulary, the memory, or cognitive development to kind of know how syntax works. But between 15 and 24 months, so between towards the end of the one word and up towards 6 months past the 2 words, vocabulary increases a lot from about 50 to 400 words. So there's a real boom towards the second half of the second year. Now, there are cultural differences. North American English speakers are more likely to use nouns, and Chinese Mandarin speakers verbs, your book points out. But by 20 months, there's a lot of similarity that nouns are really the types of words that kids know more often cross-culturally. The first sentence, this also can kind of coincide with the 18-month time period because you can link words together to make a sentence. So dog bark is kind of a proto-sentence. And the bigger thing here is not so much the words as much as what they mean. Typically, the first sentence is just an observation. Dog bark. So, underextension and overextension are 2 kind of important things because, in a way, they that'll be a quiz for you. See what you think these relate to. So, underextension is where you use words too restrictively, which is common in young children. So when the underextension is when they think a word refers to a specific instance of a concept instead of all. They think a word refers to a specific instance instead of all of them. So this could be an example if your dog is dog. If dog is dog and there are no other dogs, just dog. If my daughter thought our dog Lexi was dog and any other dog in the world was not a dog because Lexi is dog, that would be underextension. Overextension, on the other hand, are where you use words too broadly. You overgeneralize the meaning. So if buses, trucks, and tractors are all cars. So now, one thing about this overextension that isn't that bad of a thing is that it's a good thing that they're making categories. We might like to say romantically that we don't want people to put people and things in categories. It starts this discriminatory process early on, it does, but it's actually a really good thing cognitively. It shows that they're making categories where they can find similarities and differences between things. It's actually a really cool moment when you notice that they're taking a word and applying it to something else because of, well, you might not even be sure of what, but the first time my daughter knew that the duck toy that she had was a duck in a book was also a duck, that was pretty cool. That shows cognitive growth. And think about, and when I said there's a little quiz, this should remind you of assimilation accommodation. The next thing is just the chart to give you an overview of age in months with both vocalization and language comprehension, but we're not going to talk about anything in here. You can take a look if it helps you. So how do we help kids speak? Well, the first is through infant-directed speech. Infant-directed speech is a type of speech that categorizes much of our style and communication towards infants, but it turns out also pets. Back in the day, it was called motherese, but that's no longer accepted because it's not just done by mothers. It also can be referred to as child-directed speech, but it's stronger with infants. It gets weaker and weaker as it goes on. So what is it? It's speech made of simple, short sentences that has pitches that are higher, that has frequencies that have a larger range, intonation more varied. The repetition is key. They repeat things a lot, and oftentimes has topics at an infant's level. So oftentimes will just be based on things a kid is doing or they see things around them. So it might be if you see a dog and the dog barks, you might say, "What does a doggy say?" And you could say that multiple times or something like that. Just go and talk to a kid. You'll start doing it automatically. Or even dogs, you will probably end up doing that with. Around the first year, it becomes a little bit more adult-like. And the reason that we think this is big is that this actually, not just the 1 year mark, but in general, infant-directed speech, is it seems to help with language development. This happens all around the world. There are cultural variations in how it occurs. But babies who are exposed to more infant-directed speech tend to begin word use and other linguistic aspects earlier than those who don't. There are also gender differences in here, although it might be better to call them sex differences at this point, depending on your definition of sex and gender, but I digress. Girls are more likely to have blankies and doggies, whereas boys are more likely to have blankets and dogs. And this is true virtually from birth. The language that parents use is different. There are, the estimate in your book was that by 32 months, girls hear twice as many diminutives as boys. So that's where you take something, put an IES at the end. So instead of a dog, it's a doggy. That's a diminutive. And this does decline with age, but it still occurs. So even from birth, we're talking to boys and girls differently. Also, responses to children are different. Boys are much more likely to hear no than girls. Girls, you're more likely to soften any kind of no with a diversionary response. So why don't you do this instead? And just kind of across the board, boys tend to hear firmer, clearer language, and girls tend to be spoken to more warmly and more emotionally. And there's no proof that this has an effect. We don't like the P word, but nonetheless. But it is true that later in life, women do tend to use more tentative, less assertive language than men. Men use more assertive language. So perhaps there is a beginning here. But regardless, it could just be the beginning of gender socialization as we know it. So some more, and let's move into a little bit more detail. So we care so much about language because it lays the groundwork for cognitive and other social tasks. And we know that preschoolers who don't speak clearly are less able to play with children, less able to perform well in school, all of these types of things. Now, there's a lot of variability in how well children use language and how many words they have. So 22 to 27-month-old infants, vocabulary can vary from 75 words to more than 500. That is a huge, huge variability. So language delays. Why do some of these delays occur? Well, we know it's heritable, but there's more than that. I'm just going to give you a list. You don't need to know these if you don't want, but I want to give you a list of many of the things that have been found to be related to language delays. Mother's education level, family delay history, sex, neurobiological growth, birth order, number of siblings, history of ear infection, socio-emotional development, cognitive development. All of these things are related to vocabulary development. That's a lot of stuff, and that's not even all of it. And of these, being male and having a family history are the most robust indicators of language delays. But before I move on, I want to give a little piece of information from kind of a personal note that children with Down syndrome tend to have smaller ear canals, and because of this, they can have more buildup and more hearing issues. And they've actually found that could be one of the reasons that people with Down syndrome tend to have language delays, is they're more likely to get ear infections, have wax buildups, etc., etc. So one of the specialists they send you to, if you have a child with Down syndrome, is an ENT much earlier than you would with a typical child. So this seems to be something that even on the early intervention side, people are realizing that if you can't hear, you can't speak. So they were doing a lot better job of picking out things that might make delays and trying to help out early on. Okay. SES, family SES, socioeconomic status, has increasingly been seen to be a factor as well. Low SES kids have differences in language abilities at 18 months. Child care is also a big thing. The better child care, the better off they are academically, cognitively, verbal language as well. But some of it has to do with just the amount of words, quality of words children are exposed to by parents. So broadly, both the quality and quantity of parents' speech is related to quality of children's speech, quality and amount. And both of them are differently related. So parent syntax and vocabulary actually influence children. But it's only children's vocabulary that influences how parents speak, not their syntax. So if a child has really bad syntax, really bad quality of speech, that's not as big a deal as if the child can't speak as much. Meaning if they've got words but they don't make sense, that's not as big a deal. So again, another reason syntax is so important and why we started with those annoying things at the beginning of the lecture. Parent speech also might be more important for atypically developing kids. If they have brain injuries, disabilities, they're pretermed, etc. And one study found that preterm infants who were born less than 3 pounds, so very small, found that they could vocalize as early as 8 weeks before their due date. But this was if there was a strong relationship between the parental talk, or if there was strong parental verbalization in the family. And this parental talk was even above talk from other adults, meaning it didn't matter if they were around a lot of words. Well, it did matter, but it mattered more if they were around their parents, who were speaking a lot, than if they were around other adults who spoke a lot. Really, though, what is important, both number of words and amount, or type of speech. So the number of words used is related to vocabulary growth early in life, number of words a child is exposed to. And children who have professional families, meaning more kind of upper class families, they're exposed to 215,000 words on average in a 100-hour week. 215,000. For low SES families on welfare, 62,000. That is huge. 215,000 compared to 62,000 over 1 week. By age 4, that's roughly 32 million words more that a high SES versus low SES family child in those families will hear. Which we cannot say that is 100% going to be predicting all of these things, but it cannot be good. In terms of quality of speech, so that's just number of words. Quality of speech, though, the diversity of parents' vocabulary, it's actually been seen that word types, the diversity of them, might be a better predictor of growth than simple number of words. It could be. But we do know that a richer language environment predicts faster language processing, meaning you will be able to pick up on speech more if you are exposed to that. And that makes sense. If you're exposed to an environment where there's a lot of different types of speech patterns and quality, you might proceed a little bit quicker. And in my mind, this could also be why oftentimes a second child learns language quicker than the first, because the first might not have the second might have diversity in speech where they have language spoken to them in their infant-directed speech, but also they might hear language spoken to their sibling at a kind of a higher level. So this means that there would be more words to learn, more models, and they'd have practice interpreting language. And everybody knows how difficult it is to hear. To learn a foreign language if you just memorize words. It's not just memorization of words. It's a combination of remembering words and practice with them. And then the last thing I'll say is book reading seems to be very important as well. When parents read to children, children read, they point, they interact socially, emotionally. It's a good way to get across feelings. It makes me very happy when my daughter, 21 months now, but when she started pointing at pictures in books when they were crying, and she would sign crying, and then pat them sometimes to make them feel better. But that's a really good thing, that they can tell from the stories, the arcs, the pictures. They can learn what other people are feeling and thinking in all kinds of places. And it's not just that people who have a good environment read more. There are also interventions where families are provided books, extra time, and money to have them sit and read with their children. And interventions actually show this improvement in children. So even in a lower SES family, the kid, let's say the parents are not as well educated, or something that might generally predict achievement in language for whatever the reason, reading more books is a good thing. It's one of those findings that there's no time it's too early to read your children books. And sometimes, as a kind of unscientific parenting hint, I found that my first daughter, she would not be as fussy when I was reading to her. So within the first couple weeks of her life, she already had heard Harry Potter and Lion Witch in the Wardrobe and stuff like that. And sometimes them just hearing your voice can be more soothing than just being rocked or something like that.